So I wondered if you could just give us a bit of an overview about the British Paraorchestra, what it is and what you guys do.
Sure. Paraorchestra is the world's first large-scale, fully integrated orchestra of professional, disabled and non-disabled musicians, and we're based here in Bristol. Haven't always been based here in Bristol. We were set up in 2012 by a conductor called Charles Hazelwood, who lives here in the southwest. And our first ever gig really was at the closing ceremony of the Paralympic Games in London with Coldplay. So it was a kind of low-key first gig.
What a way to start. Wow.
Yeah, it was quite amazing. It was a kind of really special moment. If you're like me, I have so many special memories of that summer of 2012 with the Olympic Games and the Paralympic Games coming to London. And I think everyone was surprised almost or kind of overjoyed with how much of an impact the Paralympic Games had on perception of professional disability sport, and how far that had come in the 60, 70 years that it had been kind of in existence. And Charles spotted this moment where actually he could do something similar or start a conversation around disability in music, professional music making. And that came out because Charles has a daughter with cerebral palsy. And so having Eliza in his family opened his mind to this whole community of disabled people. And obviously up until that point, Charles had been conducting orchestras around the world for many years, but he realized that very few of the musicians he'd worked with up until that point openly identified as being disabled. So it got him thinking about why that was and why there weren't more opportunities for disabled musicians of all kinds. So he set up Paraorchestra. I was one of the first members to join as a clarinet player. At the time, I was studying at the Royal Academy of Music in London as a composer and second study clarinet player. And I met Charles through a mutual friend or a mutual acquaintance. And it just became clear to me straight away that he was utterly serious about creating the best kind of music making. I wasn't going to be interested in something that was kind of like a tokenistic, nice to have project and sort of fluffy project, which I'm afraid, very often projects that kind of work in this area with disability in music kind of expect less from the musicians that are disabled than those that are non-disabled. That's just, it might sound a bit harsh, but I think that's the perception I have often felt. Just, underneath the surface, people kind of accept that, oh, well, it's nice that, the disabled musicians took part, but really, you would go to a group of non-disabled musicians to kind of get your fix of amazing music making. And what I really liked about Charles's approach was that he wanted to completely break down that perception and change that perception. So yeah, we had 17 musicians performing at the closing ceremony with Coldplay. And then obviously that was an amazing kind of moment. And I think the challenge I then kind of left the story in terms of the development of Paraorchestra. I was still involved as a musician, but for a few years, Charles then had to find a way of taking that amazing moment and that amazing exposure, worldwide exposure, and turning it into something that could become more strategic and something that could become longer term, because of course that was only the start of the journey rather than the end, that moment at the Paralympics. And so fast forward a few years where, we did a few projects internationally, and a few projects here in the UK, but nothing that was really sort of sustaining the Paraorchestra as a kind of full-time entity. But fast forward a few years and the organisation relocated to Bristol. and we became a charity, and we set up an office at We the Curious, actually, in Bristol, the Science Centre in Bristol. And we got some seed funding from our friends at Arts Council England, who spotted this opportunity for the Southwest to become a kind of a centre of excellence for inclusive music making, as did our friends at the Bristol Music Trust as well, who run what was then called the Colston Hall, now called Bristol Beacon. So all of these kind of things came together at a really opportune moment. I was still living in London, freelancing as a musician and playing with Paraorchestra from time to time. And then I was asked to join Paraorchestra on a more full-time basis as associate music director. And I was commuting a lot from London to Bristol, and gradually over that time, through staying 1-2 nights a week in an Airbnb in Bristol, really sort of fell in love with the city of Bristol. I love the energy of the city here. I love the music scene. I like the fact that it has a kind of a generous but also kind of independent mindset. It's not too, people in Bristol aren't like kind of easily overawed. Just kind of like, they say it as it is, and they want good music making, they want creative ideas, they want kind of stuff that is, they want things to happen, and they make things happen. So I just really love the energy of the city here and the music scene here. And so in 2018, well, just over 2 years ago now, I moved to Bristol myself, and I've been based here ever since. And the Paraorchestra, I'm pleased to say, has gone from strength to strength. We have played several times at Glastonbury, headlining Park Stage there. We played at WOMAD. We played at Motion Nightclub here in Bristol, of course. We played at the Colston Hall before it shut for renovations. Played at St George's. So we've gradually become, I think, part of the fabric of the music scene in Bristol. And I think we're here for the long term now, and obviously when Bristol Beacon reopens in however long it takes to rebuild and complete the renovation, I think that will be a moment where people, I hope, will become even more aware of our presence within the city, because of course we'll be able to do more gigs at what I'm sure will be an absolutely stunning space for live music making. And yeah, I think it's somehow really appropriate that Bristol is the home for Paraorchestra because of that sense of adventure and innovation that Bristol has. Of course, it happens at your university as well. Yeah, it's just the perfect setting for a group like Paraorchestra to find its home and for these experiments to happen here. So yeah, really, I'm really personally and professionally proud to call Bristol my home.
How many musicians do you have in the Paraorchestra now? So you've told us a little bit about how the orchestra came together. You said that there were 17 musicians back in 2012. So where are you guys at now?
So we now have just under 30 musicians. And of course, over the years, musicians have come and gone, and people, their priorities change, or they go on to other things and work in other areas or in other parts of the world. But we're now at just under a core of 30 deaf and disabled professional musicians. And the model we have now is we draw from that pool of musicians for our projects. So we are ostensibly a freelance orchestra from which we can draw various musicians for different projects. And the reason we take that model is because the range of our projects is so huge. So, and this comes from Charles's vision. Charles is a conductor who doesn't believe in kind of, putting people in boxes and kind of having, a group of classical musicians who only play Beethoven symphonies and having a group of jazzers who, only play jazz and R&B, or having a singer who only sings kind of in the operatic tradition or the pop tradition. We're just as comfortable, as I say, like playing Kraftwerk in a nightclub setting as we are playing the music of Barry White at Glastonbury, as we are playing the music of Beethoven at the South Bank Centre, or the music of Steve Reich and the Minimalists at an art gallery in Moscow. Like, the range of our work is so huge, and it's what attracts me to it as well. So that's why we have this flexible model of working, because of course some musicians don't fit into some projects. So, you know, we can't always use all of our musicians across all of those projects, A, because they wouldn't have enough time in their schedule, but B, because not all of our projects, you know, require that full range of musicians, from those who use assisted tech to those who play electric guitar, or those who sing, or those who just play an orchestral instrument. So we have that core of 30 or so musicians who identify as disabled. And then beyond that, we have a further pool of freelance musicians who may identify as non-disabled musicians, who join that group of musicians whenever we're on the road. So it's a slightly complicated story, and we've sort of built this up over the years, but originally we had kind of two groups under the Paraorchestra and Friends umbrella. It was a group called Army of Generals and a group called British Paraorchestra. And the Army of Generals group would tend to be, say, the string players who didn't identify as disabled but would join our projects, and the Paraorchestra group would be those who had additional access requirements. And what we do now is we've kind of gotten rid of those labels, because I'm personally not comfortable, I don't think any of us are comfortable with, you know, that idea of kind of needlessly segregating people or drawing lines between people. So everybody who's in our family of musicians now plays under the banner of Paraorchestra, whether or not they identify as disabled. And so the access, we have a wonderful team of coordinators and producers who work tirelessly behind the scenes to make sure that those who require additional points of access, or have additional needs, whether it making sure they can reach the stage or the venue via a wheelchair ramp, or making sure that they have accessible hotel rooms and bathrooms while we're on tour, or making sure that the hearing impaired members of the ensemble can hear the conductor, often Charles, at the front of the room via a T loop, or an amplification device, or our visually impaired musicians or blind musicians having braille music sent to them ahead of the rehearsal so they can learn the part from memory, or if there's someone who has a fluctuating condition, maybe they have ME or MS, and it means that they may require kind of a quiet room in between a rehearsal and a concert with, you know, a bed or a comfortable sort of surface to lie flat on so they can take some rest. These things are all taken into account, but kind of, you know, in the background. So that it's all with the aim of allowing our disabled musicians to play at their very best when it comes to the rehearsals or the concerts. So that's the model we've kind of arrived at. And so our hope really is that when at the point of music making, at the point of delivering kind of a performance, the disability actually does become irrelevant. You know, it's not up to us to kind of push any sort of label or identity onto our musicians, because they all have, you know, some of them are very active in the world of kind of, you know, disability activism and politics and campaigning, and that's great. If they want to do that, that's fine. Equally, there are some who are less kind of familiar or comfortable with that world. And so our job is simply to make sure that they can play at their best. And then, as I say, when you're in the gig, you know, you certainly can't tell the difference in quality between a musician who has a disability and one who doesn't, because there is no difference. So that's kind of a very long answer to your question, but it's like that's kind of the mantra and the model in which we're operating now.
That's really, really interesting. I'm fascinated by the comprehensive list of different types of considerations that you need to have as an organisation, and I'm just wondering what other large organisations have to learn from that in terms of supporting our staff who might identify as disabled, because clearly you've got a really comprehensive understanding of the needs and requirements of your professional musicians, and then you've been able to put things in place. What do you think has been the key part of making that discussion so successful?
I think it's communication and trust with our musicians. So when we invite them into the talent pool, into the Parrot Orchestra family of musicians, there is I think at first contact, I hope there's like a sense of warmth and kind of friendliness. It's not kind of, it's a professional environment, but it's also one where we can all be kind and generous to each other and understanding of each other. And then with our coordinators and our producers and everybody who's in the team who needs to know certain information about a musician, will be told with that musician's permission. And I think we built that trust up over time. So we don't pretend that we always have the answers. We don't. We've learned over time how to deliver this as well. But we always do our best to communicate with the musicians, what the state of play is in any given project. I mean, this has been especially the case during the COVID pandemic, obviously. We're talking in November now, and 2 months ago we did our first project, first in-person project without a live audience. It was a recording project for a TV documentary that Charles has been making, and we brought together a 50-piece orchestra, a large proportion of whom were disabled, and of course we had to put the work in ahead of those rehearsals and that recording session in London to make sure that our musicians were comfortable attending those recording sessions. Many of them have been shielding through the height of the pandemic, certainly throughout the first wave, and they were the last to come out of shielding or full lockdown. And they have kind of conditions or disabilities that make them more vulnerable or make them more susceptible to or more at risk, basically. And I think it's a credit, I can't take personal credit for this, but the team who worked so hard behind the scene to keep in contact with our musicians and to book all of the hotel rooms and the travel and to put what's needed in place. They were in touch with each and every one of our musicians with a full set of risk assessments, of information about where we would be playing, how would we be playing, the protocols we put in place around wearing masks in the venues, 2-meter distancing, etc. There's a whole great big long list, but the communication meant that every player who was asked to join the project was very happy to, because they trusted us to deliver that project safely and to not put anyone at any more risk than they needed to be. So I think trust is a big part of it. Also, a lot of it comes from Charles as well, from his leadership. He's been our artistic director since the very beginning. It's 8 or 9 years now since he had this gem of an idea. And if you see how the Parrot Orchestra has grown and changed and expanded over that time, it's very difficult to kind of argue against the idea that Charles is 100% committed to the cause, and also leads from the front in the sense of, his generosity to me and to everyone else in the team is so kind of abundant and clear. And he is someone who's interested in a two-way dialogue. He doesn't work in the way of, kind of a maestro, a kind of traditional scary maestro who's kind of in charge of everything. He's very much interested in hearing from the musicians as well, in a sort of two-way street. And I think that model is something that enables our musicians to feel kind of empowered and enabled in all senses of that word. So his leadership, I think, is really important, and he often talks about fostering trust in musicians as a conductor. There's a really good TED talk I'd recommend I think he was given not long after he set up the Paraorchestra, but he talking about trusting the ensemble. And what he has to do as a conductor. The conductor or the leader of a music project is the only person who is not making a sound. They have to trust the musicians to kind of follow their gesture or to follow their lead, and to make the sound, to make the music happen. The conductor at the end of the day can't actually make that sound happen in the performance. It has to be the musicians who do that. And equally, Charles is, I think what I love about Charles as well is that he is really open himself to learning as well. He doesn't pretend that he has all of the answers all of the time. Of course, he has a huge amount of experience and a really sort of crystalline vision of where he wants us to go artistically, and he's always been clear about, he wants a world where kind of there is no difference in opportunity and quality of opportunity for disabled musicians to their non-disabled counterparts. But he also is, for instance, one example of this is where, as a conductor, he hadn't worked very much. It had never worked, in fact, with anyone who was blind in the ensemble. So if you think about, conductor is normally a process of following visually cues from musicians have to follow the conductor with visual non-audio cues. And so Charles had to get used to this idea that some musicians in that ensemble may not be seeing him or following him at all, and they may be following his cues but via another player, for instance. So if you're a viola player, you might be listening out for an in-breath. So as Charles, gives an upbeat into the start of a piece, you might be listening to that or feeling, like almost sort of by osmosis, that sense of, and there's a downbeat. It's a fascinating process, and I could talk for hours and hours just about that whole idea. But Charles, what I love about Charles is that he's not someone who feels he has to kind of micromanage that. He allows the players to find their own way of delivering the goods, and that may not always be in the conventional way, but it is, as long as it works for them, then it works for Charles, which is just wonderful.
Yeah, it's amazing. I think there'll be people who may be listening to this who are very intrigued by how a professional musician who's also deaf is able to work with their craft. I'd be really interested to hear again how that works in the Paraorchestra, and how those musicians are able to do what they do.
Sure. Well, I have a hearing impairment myself, so I wear 2 digital hearing aids, and I've had a hearing impairment since I was 3-4 years old, and it's a moderate to severe hearing loss in both ears, particularly in the high frequency. So, a very high violin line, or, a very soft, high, melody might be slightly beyond my hearing range. But clarinet, I feel really lucky that I've chosen the clarinet as my main instrument, because if you think about it, it's the ultimate kind of, it's a very ergonomic instrument for starters. You sort of stick it in your gob and you just sort of play the thing, and you can, you blow air down it and you get a result. But with the fingers, around the clarinet, you actually have 10 contact patches with the instrument, with this cylinder of air, this column of air that is vibrating in a way that then produces the sound. Okay, dummy guide to physics. I don't know any more than that. But what I like about it, and this came from a teacher I had at school called Jo Patton, who's a wonderful clarinet teacher. She is second clarinet in the CBSO, City of Birmingham Symphony Orchestra. And she was such an influence on me because in my first, this was at Cheetham School of Music in Manchester, and I was just like 14, 15 years old, went for my first lesson with Jo, and rather than trying to sort of avoid the topic of my hearing impairment or try to go, right, well, we'll circumnavigate that or we'll work against it or it's like a barrier that has to be overcome, it was like, no, we're going to sort of address it head on, and we're going to work with your hearing loss, or with not even your hearing loss, just with your hearing, to invert it slightly, rather than always seeing something as being lost, actually work with what you have. And of course, she was perceptive enough, because she's a brilliant teacher and she's a wonderful human being. She was sort of perceptive enough to sort of experiment a lot with how the sound actually feels underneath my fingers. So a lot of my way of playing nowadays is I think I have because of Jo's sort of influence on me, I have a really instinctive way of playing. Which is neither better nor worse than anyone else's way of playing, but just I think I depend a lot on how something feels and how it feels like in my gut and underneath my fingers and in my sort of what we call the embouchure area of the sort of the mouth, and how the reed is vibrating, or how the reed feels today, and how we would do a lot of work on playing long notes. So in those early lessons I had with Jo, it would just be, okay, play a low G on the clarinet, a nice, rich, warm, sonorous sound. Low G on the clarinet is all fingers down. And I would play the note, and then we would experiment with, changing the embouchure slightly, or changing the amount of air going down the instrument, or kind of thinking carefully about, fine-tuning adjustments until the sound was sonorous and rich and pleasant to listen to. And then Jo would stop me and go, right, can you feel what that sound is underneath your fingers? So of course I can hear some of it through what we think of being the conventional routes for hearing sound as well, through the ears. But it was actually really sort of almost teaching myself again how to hear through my own instrument in my own way. Because of course I don't know how you perceive sound, I don't know how Jo perceives sound. Like, when people ask me how much can you hear, it's always a bit of a difficult question to answer, because it's like, well, how do you hear? How much can you hear? Like, we all have our own levels of hearing, don't we? We all have like our own unique perspective on the world. So I think it's like if you're lucky enough, as I was, to find a teacher and to have parents and friends and family and colleagues and also the means and the resources as well to go and find these opportunities to work with people who will really invest that time in you, to work at your best and to find your way of doing things, then there's no reason why music has to be a kind of or disability has to be like a sort of qualitative or quantitative thing, like, you can do less or you can hear less because of your hearing loss. I mean, yeah, maybe compared to most people, but I just hear differently because of my hearing loss. And that's a beautiful thing. Like, if we were all the same, then of course the world would be such a boring place to live and work in. So it's actually it's sort of celebrating the fact that we all have different perspectives on the world, I think, is really exciting. And then I suppose, when I met Charles at the beginning of the Paraorchestra journey, I just felt sort of really blessed again, really lucky that I've met yet another person on my journey. This was just as I was coming into my last years at music college. And I met Charles, and I just had this sense that, he kind of had that way of thinking with like that level of curiosity and no judgment, no kind of, oh, well, you can't do that. It's actually trying to find in every person he meets the best version of that person within a project. So, I think that and also the influence of my hearing loss probably goes over into my music as well. And this is not a conscious thing, it's more of an unconscious thing. I think I am naturally drawn to music because of the hearing loss in the high frequency. I tend to be drawn towards music that is quite earthy and kind of groundy and bassy, better word than groundy, bassy, and kind of, low frequencies, sort of driving, punchy music, in any kind of music, whether that's drum and bass or whether it's classical or any kind of music in between. There's some sounds that are kind of really rich but compact. I think I tend to be drawn to those sounds, and so I think a lot of my own music as a result kind of plays in that area, more than maybe the kind of very, very soft and kind of hazy, to me anyway, like hazy kind of high frequency area. So you won't, for instance, find a lot of like really high soft string harmonics in my music, because very often I think I'm not really drawn to those sounds because I don't hear very many of them. So yeah, that sort of summarizes, I think, how my hearing loss has influenced me.
Oh, that's fascinating. And I'm so intrigued in the way that working with Joe, that just reframed the whole discussion, actually, and moving it away from talking about barriers and lack, and then actually just saying, let's optimize what is here and work with that and think about perception more broadly. Actually, it's just really, really interesting.
Totally. And she, like, I just feel so lucky to have met her, because she, does play mostly in the kind of classical tradition, in an orchestra that is, one of the oldest, most prestigious orchestras in the country, the CVSO.
Yeah, I love CVSO. I was raised just near Birmingham, so.
Oh, were you?
Raised on CVSO and Symphony Hall, yeah.
Yeah, and it is a fantastic orchestra, but they work in a very different tradition to obviously the one that Paraorchestra is starting to work in. And so very often in my experience of that kind of world at academy and at other places, people are kind of quite a long way behind often in terms of this way of thinking, because society as a whole is behind as well. Like people, until you sort of have that switch sort of flicked around and gone, well, yeah, it's not. If there's a way that we can all express ourselves in a way that is authentic. Authenticity, I think, is key as well, to that person. And I think this becomes really important when so on a traditional instrument like a clarinet, there's like, several hundred years worth of kind of playing tradition. This is the way we do things. Even with like the grading system as well, with the ABRSM exams or Trinity exams or whatever sort of exam board you learn with as a classical musician, there's like, a very, over many years, there's been like an established set of sort of principles and hoops that you need to jump through. Yeah. Whereas what we're now getting to is a point where the symphony orchestra, and I'm talking a lot today in the classical tradition because that's the world I know most about, but like the symphony orchestra has basically stayed the same for 40, 50 years now. I mean, what was the last major instrument to be, to be added to the symphony orchestra? I mean, yeah, maybe some percussion instruments in their modern form, or you get the occasional saxophone, or if you're really lucky, like, a mandolin or a guitar, maybe an electric guitar. Like, but the symphony orchestra, I think, and this is where I think commissioners and those who run, like, those kind of legacy traditional institutions could be far more daring and need to be far more daring if they want to keep the symphonic orchestra kind of relevant to society. And this is where Paraorchestra, I think, is in part leading the way. It's interesting. I think a lot of the younger ensembles in the UK are doing this really exciting. I mean, I look at, Aurora Orchestra, Paraorchestra, Manchester Collective is doing really exciting work. Scottish ensemble. You know, it tends to be like the younger, slightly smaller groups, which are more kind of nimble and are able to like be more reactive to kind of things that are happening today, rather than the old model, which was like, okay, we're going to plan our concert seasons 3 or 4 years in advance. We're going to get this soloist over from Russia or Bulgaria, and we're going to book another conductor from South America or Germany, or bring them to our orchestra. They spend 3 or 4 days with us. We play to our audience, you know, a piece that has maybe been heard thousands of times before, you know, a Tchaik 5 or a Brahms 4, which again, this is all music I love, but do we need to hear it as much as we do? Maybe not. You know, I'd throw that out there as a slightly...
Well, I think you make an interesting point about whether we're really securing the survival of classical music with that approach, but that's probably a whole other rabbit hole we might get sucked into.
I've taken it slightly off topic.
Nevertheless, though, just related to this, I am really interested in the repertoire choices of the Parrot Orchestra. You listed some of these earlier in our conversation, and some of which I've seen videos of. I was really interested to know whether you choose repertoire according to how you can best display the skills and talents of the musicians that you're working with, or is it more that you choose a piece of repertoire and the orchestra just has to get on with it, which is the more classical model, or is there some kind of middle ground? Just because what you play is so diverse, it's impossible to define, and the fact that you've called yourselves a Paraorchestra might perhaps suggest that you're really only drawing on the classical tradition, but I mean, that's clearly not true at all. So I'd love to know more about how your repertoire choices are made, and then how you start to even work up your arrangements, for example, because I'm imagining some of those have to be bespoke, right?
Yeah, 100%. So Paraorchestra, yeah, in some senses might be a bit of a misnomer for our group, because many people hear Paraorchestra and they think exactly as you said, you know, that we're working in the kind of orchestral tradition. But I think we're using the word orchestra now, you know, in its very broadest sense, like its most kind of literal core meaning, you know, a collective of musicians coming together to make music, but across this huge gamut of ranges and or this huge range of styles and genres. How we choose the project is in a whole mixture of ways, really. Most of the ideas come from Charles himself. So he is our artistic director. He has, you know, in his own taste, obviously, a huge range of musical styles and genres and interests that kind of get him excited. So, for instance, I mean, I'll just give you a few examples with our tones, drones, and arpeggios project, which was a project all about the minimalist school of music. That was actually based on a TV documentary that Charles had already made about a year earlier. So it was made a wonderful 2-part documentary where he went and met many of these people for the BBC, like Terry Riley and Steve Reich, Philip Glass, Lamont Young, you know, all of these kind of legends of the minimalist scene over in the US. He made that documentary for the BBC, went down really well, and then we decided to kind of make a live show off the back of that with audio visuals. So it was kind of it certainly wasn't a gig version of the documentary. There wouldn't have been any time, you would have been days long. But it was kind of like, it was Charles's, he's such a gifted communicator anyway, like verbally as well as through music. And so he was telling his own story about how he got into that kind of music as a teenager. And he opened the show with a kind of a story about how he had a music teacher called Mr. Edmonds, who would apparently play Rainbow in Curved Air, the record by Terry Riley, at sort of full volume in their classes at school. And this was back in the, you know, when it was happening, kind of back in the late 70s. And so that obviously had a huge effect on Charles, changed his whole kind of outlook on, or widened his outlook on music. And so the gig then was kind of the thread of that story through the gig with some of these pieces included. So we did a version of Rainbow and Curved Air with, I think it was 7 or 8 musicians. I was playing keys on that one, actually. I played a synthesizer, as did Adrian Utley, the guitarist from Portishead, who also lives and works here in Bristol and is good mates with Charles. And Charles was obviously playing his beloved Wurlitzer keyboard with a Leslie cabinet to the side of it. And then we played Tubular Bells and trying to think of what else we played in the gig now. The Philip Glass music in Similar Motion. We did a new arrangement of that. We did music for 18 musicians, I think. Sorry, I'm struggling to remember exactly what repertoire we did. We've done so many different pieces. But I think, and then we had this kind of audio-visual side of it, which was made by a filmmaker called John Minton, which was kind of like a psychedelic accompaniment to a lot of this music, you know, kind of the kind of psychedelia that you would have found in sort of 70s, 80s San Francisco. So that was really amazing. So that's kind of one example. And then another example would be The Nature of Why, which is one of our most successful projects, or most, I think one of the projects that has really kind of had like a profound impact on people, both who have worked on it and been to the show. The Nature of Why started life as basically a commission for Will Gregory of Goldfrapp to compose a new piece for Paraorchestra musicians that would also be danced to. So it started life from Unlimited as a commission for, you know, music and dance, a music and dance commission. And then we developed the piece over 3 R&D workshops. So we had like three blocks of 1 week workshops with Will, Charles, a group of Paraorchestra musicians, and a wonderful choreographer called Caroline Bowditch, who at the time was living in the UK, has now moved back to her native Australia, and she is just the most extraordinary disabled choreographer who works across a whole range of kind of contemporary dance styles. So we had, you know, that kind of group of people in each of these workshops. And on the first day, well, actually, I remember the very first day that I met Caroline, I had terrible food poisoning, actually. I'll never forget that, but we'll gloss over that. So the first time she met me, I was like, you know, even paler than I normally am, and just like sort of, sorry, God, I'm going to go. So that wasn't a very auspicious start, maybe, but it turned into this most sort of joyous experience where on the first day, I think Will turned up with maybe a page and a half of music, and we had 4 or 5 days together. Obviously a completely deliberate decision on his part. He wanted to work with the musicians who were in the room. So we had 10 Paraorchestra musicians, I think it was, in that very first workshop. And he turned up with, you know, some sketches and some scratches and some scraps of music, and we were basically experimenting with, you know, within the room. So it would probably be it's not a piece co-composed by Paraorchestra musicians, but it certainly is a piece that has Paraorchestra's very unique stamp on the kind of the language and the lineup of the piece. So we'll work with the musicians, you know, through a mixture of improvisation and experimentation. Caroline worked with a group of dancers, 4 dancers, on kind of, you know, ideas for how the dance could work with the kind of sound world that Will was working within. And then go forward to workshop 2, we then started experimenting with what it would look like if the dancers and the musicians, the traditional divide between the two were blurred or completely erased altogether. So can musicians become more like dancers and dancers become like musicians? So for instance, I would be I work with 2, we went away and I worked with 2 dancers with my clarinet and my bass clarinet. And we started moving around the space. Obviously, by this point, music stands were just completely pushed aside. Any concept of sitting in your space was gone already. It was just about, can I play both sort of literally and metaphorically with the dancers and with the music, with Will's amazing music. So then that process started, and then skipping forward to workshop 3, we then took it a step further and went, okay, what would happen if the divide between dancer, musician, and audience was erased? So what happens if we get a group of, say, 100 people into the space, into this kind of 3D flat space with the musicians, and so therefore the musicians and the dancers are all around them. The sound, the art, the whole concept is all around them. So I'm sort of taking you through that process because actually that's quite typical now of how we work. It's not like we sort of arrive into a rehearsal room with a preset idea, as you say, like in the classical model of, okay, we're playing this piece, and then we're going to play that piece, and then we're going to go go to the pub or whatever. It's actually it's much more creative for everybody involved in that room, and it's not a kind of top-down organisation of it's Charles's vision or it's Caroline's vision, as it might have been in The Nature of Why or Will's vision. It's like everybody inputting with their ideas, and so the 3 workshops and the development of that show all happened over about 8-9 months. And then we actually did it here in Bristol. We premiered the piece here in Bristol as part of Mayfest, and it was co-produced by Make, who run Mayfest as well, and we did it at Bristol or Vic. And so the final result, and you can go and people are interested in hearing more about it, that there are videos of it online, and it was a kind of 360-degree immersive, maybe promenade theatre style piece with just a very kind of in some senses a very intimate experience with just 150 odd audience members on the stage of the Bristol Old Vic. So we didn't use, the audience members weren't in the kind of auditorium at all. They were just like on stage with the musicians and the dancers. And this piece played out over an hour. And, frankly, to be really honest with you, the very first time we did it, it was one of the most sort of scary, seat of your pants experiences that I've ever done. And also one of the most exhilarating, because when we got to the end of that first hour of that first show, it was like, oh my goodness, there's something incredibly special and kind of direct and raw about this sort of interchange of ideas between musician, dancer, and audience members. For the first time in my life, I would literally, in some cases, less than a meter away from audience members, sometimes even closer, and we could be playful with that. There was almost like the audience became the third actor or the third part of this whole experience. And so there was none of this kind of oh, you must be kind of quiet, or you must turn your mobile phones off, or you must you must behave in a certain polite way. It was no, we're all kind of playing, and Will came up with he's really interested in physics and in the work of Richard Feynman, who's a kind of amazing, very eccentric American physicist and quantum physicist who actually, in the year that we premiered the piece in 2018, it would have been his centenary year, and so the show kind of took on a narrative as well, around kind of the nature of curiosity, the nature of why is the world like it is. It opens with a question that a journalist asked of Richard Feynman, this scientist, which was, why do magnets repel each other? The journalist, kind of asking a very simple question, and you could see Richard Feynman almost in a slightly sort of belligerent way, slightly kind of, I cannot answer that question for you, because we all need to be in a certain framework of understanding to know, if you want to know how magnets work, well, you need to know other things about quantum theory and physics and all the rest of it. So that, for me, I think I've just spoken at length about The Nature of Why, but that I just wanted to take you through that, because that sort of epitomizes now how Paraorchestra works. It's very, very, very rare that we will simply go into a room and play a preset piece of music. unless it's for recording purposes or for documentary purposes. It will for our live experiences, which I really can't let's hope this time next year we can be in the same room and actually sharing some live music again, because I think that's where Paraorchestra is at its best and most powerful. And I think we're trying to think really creatively about what that live experience, the different types of live experience you can have for audience members.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting parallel that as an organisation, you've managed to dissolve these boundaries between disabled professional musicians and non-disabled professional musicians, and then you've actually kind of literally carried that through into your work. Do you feel like there is a relationship there in terms of this artistic direction that you've gone in terms of how you approach live performance and in fact the very values around which the orchestra has been built? Do you think that's kind of on purpose, or?
I think it's both on purpose and probably by happy accident, or there's a lot of like fortuitous kind of chance meetings as well, I'm sure, that happen. So like I think Charles is obviously the artistic director who sets the kind of the direction of travel in terms of the kinds of music we might play. And to be truthful as well, it does make our jobs harder because we're not relying on, say, doing a series of subscription concerts or events in the same venue. I mean, to think of a different parallel, for instance, it would have been very easy for us or any orchestra working like us to kind of go, all right, we're based in Bristol, so let's set up a series of subscription concerts, or a series of concerts at, say, St George's, or I love as a venue, I mean, stunning venue, or Colston Hall, Bristol Beacon. It would have been very easy for us to kind of play it safe, I suppose, and to go, right, well, our unique selling point is that we have a mixture of disabled and non-disabled musicians. But instead, I think Charles he's done so many different things, and actually got this kind of insatiable desire or insatiable appetite for pushing things further, and for pushing musicians further, pushing creatives further. And I think we thrive on that. If you're one of our trustees, actually, a wonderful lady called Anna Starkey. Anna was involved with We the Curious, and is also a kind of a Renaissance woman, really. Documentary maker, scientist, interested in the arts, and she had this amazing sort of idea that I've never forgotten. She told me once, if you feel when you're starting something or starting a project or a creative idea, if you feel like you know what you're doing, then you're probably not going to be making something very exciting, or you know what I mean? And I think that's brilliant. Like I've sort of tried to keep hold of that. It's like if I feel like I'm on the edge of, oh, will this work? Will the wheel fall? The nature of why, the brilliant example of that, I'm not going to pretend we sort of went into the first performance of that piece thinking this will work, people will love this. It's like, ooh, this is like quite dangerous. Like no one's ever tried this with music in this way, or dancers in this way. And will the audience, will they respond in a way that will help the piece or hinder it? And it was like, there were all kinds of like interesting questions. But as a result, by pushing ourselves and going to that danger zone, we created something that was actually, made a huge impact on those who see it. I hope we can do it again, and maybe if we might do a revival of it of some kind. We took it everywhere. We took it to South Bank Centre in London. We took it to Perth Festival in Australia. We took it to one of the most memorable places. We took it to was the Blackpool Empress Ballroom. So we did it in like the massive open Empress Ballroom space in Blackpool, and just the most beautiful setting. And then in the same sort of mini tour, this was last year, actually, September last year, we went from Blackpool down to Cornwall, and we did it in the Asylum, which is knee-high kind of outdoor or semi-outdoor sort of tent space on a beach in Carlion Bay in Cornwall. So it's like two completely different settings, two completely different audiences, but like the show still, it kind of worked in both of those settings in its own way. And I love that, you know, because then it means that the show can never get like boring, because you never know, the musicians and the dancers actually start the show outside of the main space. So it's literally like we move into the main space full of audience members. We don't even know how many audience members are going to be in there, if they're going to be young, old, disabled, non-disabled, you know, whether they're kind of arts lovers or not arts lovers, whether they're going to be friends, family. That's one of the funniest things, actually, when you have people come to the show who you know. And because obviously I've got used to doing this now, like, it's actually quite a funny thing to sort of walk into the space and almost see like friends of mine, like not recoil exactly, but you can tell they're sort of, oh no, don't come in. And I'm just like, if they do that, I almost try and push that even further. Then it gives me like permission to sort of to play, you know, to be playful, and so many people at the end of that show, just, you know, and they have tears in their eyes, and almost, but not from any like, oh my God, you're so inspirational what you're doing, not those kinds of tears, more like you have just moved this room, you know, like you have just created a world, like an hour of escapism, pure escapism from the world outside. It's us kind of sharing this moment of joy and exploration and genuine human connection. And I'm even getting slightly shivery just thinking about it, because it's been so long since we've done it. I'm really kind of missing that connection we have. But your question around, like, you know, kind of the range of what we do is certainly what keeps the musicians interested. But it does make our job slightly harder in the sense that we don't have any, I don't know, I've not really thought about it, but like we don't have like a set core audience in the sense of we only play heavy metal, or we only play Beethoven, or we only play minimalism. Like each project we do is almost like it's set on its own terms. So we'll work with the venue or with the promoter to kind of understand what audience it is that we're going for. Of course, you know, if we're playing somewhere like Glastonbury, it's, you know, I was going to say a captive audience, but that's not always necessarily true, obviously. Like of course, you can still have like a mass walkout from your stage if you're not doing something they like. But luckily, the been to Glastonbury 3 times now, and 3 times we've been there. Each time we've been a really special experience. The last time we went was last summer, summer 2019, and we did the Barry White project. We did the Love Unlimited Synth Orchestra, which was an amazing, like, again, Charles has always had a fascination with the music of Barry White, and it kind of, I suppose that he just had this sort of fetish for it, or this kind of itch that he couldn't get rid of. He's like, I really want to do something with Barry White and Paraorchestra. And he'd been saying this for a few years, and then I think he had a conversation with one of the stage managers at Glastonbury, you know, talking about what we might be able to do there next, and then this whole Barry White thing came up. And so last summer, on the Saturday afternoon on the Park stage, it was the really beautiful kind of sunny, boiling hot June version of Glastonbury, not the muddy, wet version of Glastonbury. Just like beautiful blue skies, music of Barry White kind of drifting across, you know, with people in their sunglasses, you know, having a beer. Just, it was, and obviously I was on stage like playing, but and with a whole series of artists, Nadine Shah and Griff Reese, and, you know, lots of kind of, Yolanda Brown, the saxophonist, came and joined us for a few things. They were just like guest artists kind of joining our family of musicians for that set. Was just joyous. It was just really, really good fun. And when I first started out in the game, like, or in the learning the clarinet, that wasn't my dream. I didn't expect to be doing that kind of music. But the fact that has come into my life through Paraorchestra is just such a bonus for me, or it's now, I can't imagine it any other way now. I would never want to be kind of stuck in only one kind of music, stuck creating just one kind of music. So yeah.
Okay, wow.
Yeah.
Would love to have been at some of those. I wonder, it's a bit of a serious tangent for a moment. I was just interested in, you were describing that moment, in the tent venue there in the Southwest, and that kind of the way that an audience can be moved to tears by an artistic experience, by a music experience in particular. And I was very struck by you saying those were not people going, "Oh, it's so inspirational." We're trying to avoid that, right? I really, really hear that. But at the same time, do you feel that because of the identity of the Paraorchestra as explicitly having disabled musicians, do you see your role as having a kind of element of activism in what you're trying to do? So not in terms of how you've already described, like, we're not looking for a kind of woolly, fluffy, "Oh, that was nice, well done, disabled musicians" type thing, trying to completely avoid that, dismantle that, and use the language of excellence and parity. But nevertheless, there is a sort of activist element. I'm just wondering how you sort of hold these things in tension. Is that part of how you see your work? Or do you really like to keep a bit of an arm's length from that aspect? How do you see all of that operating for yourselves?
Really interesting question. And I think it's something that it's constantly in flux, I think. So we certainly don't keep an arm's length from it. So I think the first answer is, because of the context in which this group was set up, as in, Charles was so clear from the start that he felt when he was talking to people of all kinds, he talked a lot publicly about when he first approached LOCOG, the London Olympic organising committee, back in early 2011, I think it was, the year before. So this was before Paraorchestra was even set up as a physical entity. He was talking to them about this idea of maybe, doing something as part of the Cultural Olympiad that was running, or maybe even something in the ceremony. But he constantly felt like no one trusted that it would be any good, actually, to be completely blunt. And of course, there's so much amazing work around, when people think of disability in music, I think many people in the UK immediately go to kind of music therapy. Their mind goes to that, the wonderful work that's happening in music therapy, music as a kind of therapeutic tool for young, profoundly disabled children often, or profoundly deaf children. And their mind goes to that, but they struggle to make the jump to professional disabled music making. So I think with that context in mind, I think for the first, bearing in mind we're still only 7-8 years old, which in the long, the grand scheme of things is tiny, really. I think Charles has been very aware of constantly pushing the idea, or not even pushing, letting the music and letting the quality of the music making speak for itself. So, and getting to a point now, which I think we're only just really starting to get to, actually, in terms of how other people see us, how the rest of the industry sees us. For many years we were just kind of out there, doing our own thing on the side. But when we've started having more recognition from our peers in the industry and from audiences, have started having more people approach us, asking us how we make this approach work. And so I think by keeping like an absolute laser-like focus on making sure that the music is of a really high quality that people want to see, we're making experiences that people want to experience. And when they hear the word Paraorchestra, they will think immediately, what my dream would be, I'm sort of jumping around in my brain. My dream would be if they hear the word Paraorchestra, they think of either the last show they've seen that we've done that oh my God, it's lovely, or they just think, oh yeah, Paraorchestra, yeah, excellent music making, or, you know, something that they've seen us do that they're like, wow, that made a real impact on me in a positive way. And then by extension, if their perception of disability is changed, or what disabled people can do is changed, then so much the better. But the activism thing is a really interesting one, particularly in an orchestra as well, because as I mentioned briefly earlier, when you have an orchestra of musicians who do their communication through the music, it's quite it's an interesting challenge that I don't think we've yet solved. But it's like, for those people in the group who want to play an activist role in the sort of the wider thing, obviously, even just take this month now, there's been a lot of discussion around the 25th anniversary of the Disability Discrimination Act. BBC are doing a big season around a season called The Crypt Tales, and actually having disabled actors and writers and creatives tell stories about disability and the deaf and disabled experience from the people in their own words. So I think our first priority will remain as making excellent music making and letting that do the talking. But increasingly, we are finding ways of allowing our musicians to also, speak for themselves as well. Not that they've not been able to speak for themselves, but just bringing them into that story of sharing their talents, promoting their own talents. I think increasingly, and the reason I'm slightly hesitant around all this is because obviously this year in 2020 we've had a bit of a pause really on our live music making. So up until this point we've been on a kind of hamster wheel of to the next project, to the next project, to the next project, to the next country music venue, whatever it is that we're doing. Whereas this year has actually in some ways given us a very positive thing, in that it's given us time to think and to regroup and to also discuss more openly with our musicians their experiences. I wish it hadn't taken a global pandemic, for it to do that. But one of the challenges for us as well is that our musicians, we draw our membership nationwide. So we've never had even though we are based here in Bristol, our office is based here, our orchestra is run from Bristol. We have members, some of whom live in Bristol, some of whom live in Scotland, Manchester, London, Cornwall, Wales, wherever it might be. So the pandemic has also given us another opportunity. We've become closer to our membership in that we've been setting up monthly Zoom calls with our musicians so that they can share, it's almost like an informal forum in which they can share ideas with each other. They can share their experiences, they can share their music, ideas for collaborations. And what we're starting to see now is almost like independent of Paraorchestra, some of those collaborations and conversations are starting to lead on to other interesting things. So it's a really interesting question, and I think it's one that we're still, fully understanding, what our place is. But I can tell you what we definitely don't want it to be, which is we don't want Paraorchestra to kind of exist as a vehicle for these talented musicians who traditionally haven't had the opportunities they deserve to play, and then for nothing else to happen, either side of that. I mean, the advantage of us being a freelance orchestra is that, of course, those musicians can go and do other things. They can go and teach. They can go and work in something completely separate from music, and then come and play and perform in Paraorchestra from time to time. But we don't want. It would be pointless, really, actually, if it was only Paraorchestra delivering these kind of opportunities. So it's kind of not in our control whether other orchestras follow the lead of Paraorchestra. It's not in our control if, in 5 to 10 years' time, there are still very few disabled musicians in those other orchestras. But what is in our control very much so is, how we can make a model of best practice within our own group. Because, Charles has been talking about this for several years already, and actually, I think really in other orchestras, they have been slow to catch up. There's still a sense of, there's like a sense of segregation, even when they do find, opportunities for disabled musicians to join their professional non-disabled musicians. I'm often seeing examples of kind of, a group of disabled musicians here, a group of non-disabled musicians there. They play together for a couple of days and then they go home. And that, I think, is not going to be a sustainable model, I don't think. I think the model we've sort of arrived at with Paraorchestra and are continually developing, in my view, the more sustainable way forwards, where quality and depth of engagement with those musicians and with those audiences is paramount.
Yeah. I'm interested to know where your musicians may play less traditional instruments. So I'm thinking about those other orchestras and how they may be more inclusive for professional musicians who identify as disabled. It seems to me that you as an organisation have managed to do that by opening up your range of instruments and using different technology. I think firstly it'd be actually quite interesting to hear a bit more about that, because some people might not really be able to even imagine what that is and what kinds of technology and how you approach that. And I'd be interested to know your reflections about how more traditional orchestras might diversify their thinking in these kinds of areas, because of course one of the joys of working with the classical canon, if you're a standard symphony orchestra, is that you've kind of already got right there in the packet what you're going to need. You know what it's going to be, you've already hired all those players, off you go. And obviously, whilst there is a bit of a difference in the size of orchestra for Mozart versus Tchaikovsky, it's still essentially the same kit, right? Exactly. So first of all, maybe if you could just tell us a little bit more about the kind of non-traditional instruments and any use of technology that goes on in the Paraorchestra as a kind of setting off point for this discussion.
Yeah, sure. So we have several musicians who only work through electronics. One of our musicians, who's actually a trustee of ours as well, Clarence Adu, who's very well known in this kind of, he was one of our founding members, and he uses an instrument called the clarion, which actually is an instrument developed by another charity based here in Bristol, Open Up Music, who do amazing work with disabled young musicians and setting up national open youth orchestras, and I'm sure you know about that already. So he uses the clarion and the headspace, and what that allows him to do is to, he's paraplegic, so he uses technology that means that his eye movement and also some range of movement in his fingers can trigger different samples, different notes, different instruments on his laptop in front of him. So he developed this over many years with various collaborators. Another example would be a musician who joined us 12, 18 months ago now, who a guy called Steve Barden, who is just, he uses a whole gamut of, or a whole table full of, loop pedals, of crushers and filters, and kind of it makes music in the sort of synthesized way. So he can both intake, maybe music that's been made elsewhere in the ensemble and then manipulate that, or he comes pre-prepared with ideas or samples or sounds that are then integrated into the setup. Also, I should also say as well, I forgot to answer a question you asked earlier around like the idea of arrangements. So this is a really important area. Like, we have one of our regular collaborators is someone called Charlotte Harding, who is an amazing arranger, composer. And so in the Tones, Drones and Minimalism project, she might rearrange certain tracks or pieces in that project to then incorporate the musicians that I'm talking about, particularly the musicians who they have no other music in terms of the orchestral world. There needs to be a way that they can play music that is kind of integral to that, rather than a kind of add-on. It's a sort of music that is sits at the heart of what's going on in any given piece. So Charlotte is a really key collaborator for us and has done many of our arrangements, and also me and her collaborated on the Kraftwerk rework project as well, which was based on Trans Europe Express, the Kraftwerk album from 1977, I think it was. And in that piece, we had Clarence, for instance. He was one of the musicians playing on the clarion. We then had a bank of synthesizers. We had an electric drum kit with lots of sort of triggers and synthesizers from that as well. Steph West, another one of our regular musicians, she played an electro harp, so she had like a normal folk harp that she sometimes played with, but she had an electro harp which then could be plugged in via a direct input and sent to a desk, and then would not be drowned by the rest of the ensemble. So a lot of our projects kind of use these kind of interesting bespoke combinations of instruments. And so I think, the key then is to make sure that actually you are commissioning original music or arrangements of music that can incorporate these different instruments. And the difficulty, I suppose, with the traditional orchestral model is that, as you say, many orchestras are they're on a salaried model, or they have musicians that they need to use a certain number of times a year. And I appreciate that does make it harder then to diversify the kind of the range of music that you want to make, even if you're commissioning a piece of music. I think commissioning might often involve, a 5-6 minute concert opener for the same forces that are playing the Beethoven piano concerto, before the interval. And I think that's the style of commissioning and the style of working that really can hold, is holding everything back. I think if orchestras were able to be more dynamic and responsive and commission music for maybe sometimes smaller but more bespoke groups of musicians, with some of the musicians I mentioned, from different musical traditions, I think both the art would be stronger and more interesting anyway, because it would be bringing in a wider range of people, and also would be more inclusive, and more you would be creating more work for a wider range of musicians. And perhaps most importantly, even beyond the sort of the economic model, is actually you're keeping the art form kind of alive with new ideas, or you're keeping it kind of moving forward, so that we don't end up with this kind of stasis that we're now in, where the orchestra is kind of this set model in most people's minds that can't be added to or subtracted away from, except in very limited circumstances. So I think we're constantly experimenting with technology like that within the orchestra. I should also talk a little bit about the technology we're exploring, kind of not maybe as instruments, but either as tools for those musicians or for audience members. So we did a project a couple of years ago with a haptic baton, which was a baton that was designed to allow visually impaired or blind musicians to follow a conductor's beat. Now, this was a concept and is still in a kind of concept stage, but we work with a wonderful technologist called Vakan Mortasian, who basically came to us with this baton, and we brought together some of our blind musicians and tested it in a closed environment. So worked out, what worked with it, what needed improvement, or how the music obviously is a very different way of sort of following a conductor via a kind of a vibrating bracelet that you could either place on your arm or your ankle, or even have like a belt around your waist. And so we were exploring all these different ways that maybe one day there could be a form of a baton that would be accurate enough and responsive enough to follow a conductive beat. 1, 2, 3, 4. You get like a trigger on each of those points of a conductive beat. So that was a piece of the technology we were excited about. And also a piece of technology we're working on at the moment through a project we've been doing with the Bath and Bristol creative cluster, is something designed for hearing impaired and deaf audiences to be able to zone in on certain instruments. So taking the nature of Y model I mentioned earlier, where audiences might be in the same space as musicians and actually come very close to those musicians who are making the music, could we find a device that enables an audience member they could carry it in their pocket and they could take it out and point it at a violinist, or put it next to a piano, or put it on top of a drum, and it would vibrate in sympathy with or give a representation of the sound that instrument is making. So we're in quite early discussions, or in sort of experimenting with that at the moment as part of a piece of research we're doing as part of a cluster of people. So these technologies obviously take many years to develop and for them to become like fine-tuned, but we are interested in being part of that kind of technological development as well, where we can.
Yeah, fascinating. I'm very intrigued about the idea of haptic baton. I'm trying to imagine what that would feel like. I'm a French horn player. Was my first study. Yeah. Just thinking, I think I have to have that on my foot.
Exactly. Well, I tried it, I was part of the group who obviously I am able to follow. I have enough vision to see the conductor, so I tried it almost just out of curiosity, and I found it really interesting because it led us into questions of how, why do we follow a conductor, or what do we need a conductor for? And what was interesting about it was that it was most useful in the experiments we were doing. It was most useful when starting the music. So we did a few experiments where, Charles would give an upbeat and then everyone would play on that first beat, and it worked really well. But what was then interesting was that it led us into questions which wasn't around maybe the technology itself, but more of a philosophical question around, well, do you need a conductor once the music has started? Always. And sometimes you don't. Sorry, Charles, you're going to hate me there. But, it's like that idea of actually, what is the conductor there for? And the conductor, so often with high-level musicians, is not there to beat time. They're there to inspire, to cajole, to marshal, to sort of supercharge the performance in whatever way that might be. But it's not necessarily there to go 1, 2, 3, 4. And that would be a really boring conductor if they only did that. So that's why, the technology was really interesting, and we haven't taken it forward yet because it probably needs some more work. We don't use it in our day-to-day projects, but just having explorations like that and discussions like that and being parts of those sort of the cutting edge of technology that in another 5 to 10 years might be applicable in the sort of professional rehearsal environment is very exciting. Of course, the disadvantage of technology is that it's often very expensive, and so I think it's very easy for us to, I think what we're trying to focus on at the moment is, work out the balance of artistic work and developing that artistic work, which is in itself quite expensive because of the way in which we do it through the sort of the R&D process, against the activism work, which you mentioned already. How much do we play in that space? Against the technology work, how much do we play? Against another area we haven't, we quite openly say we haven't worked in is education. Now, that's not because we don't want to work in education, but it's because as a relatively young ensemble, it's I think we have to choose our battles to a certain extent and choose where we put our resources into. And of course, there are some organisations who are doing brilliant work, like Open Up Music being the most obvious example, where they have a much greater degree of expertise and investment in that area. So there would be no point in us replicating or duplicating simply what Open Up Music does, or for that matter, what London Symphony Orchestra does. Or, it's like, in a few years' time, I would love to find a way of, I would love to know, okay, what would a Paraorchestra education program look like? And that's very much a question at the moment, rather than we have no answer to that yet. Because I think, other orchestras and organizations, they've had a 80-year head start on us in some cases. So we shouldn't be too hard on ourselves, I don't think. But there is obviously, having said that the end game is to have many more disabled musicians come through to Paraorchestra, of course, I absolutely understand that they will, the route by which they start that whole journey is through being inspired. They realise that it's possible to pick up an instrument, even if they have a limb impairment or a hearing impairment, or they're blind, or they are paraplegic. They have to know that it's possible in the first place. So I think, us using the role models, the potential role models we have within our orchestra, is going to become ever more important, so that we can sort of replenish the talent pool. And so Paraorchestra can keep being this kind of beacon of inclusivity.
Yes, and excellence. That's the thing, isn't it? That's the kind of unique aspect. I wondered, you kind of drawn me on to one of the last things I wanted to talk about before you perhaps give us an update as to what's next for you guys. I wondered how was it you even recruit musicians? Because, as you said, there is perhaps a lack of understanding of musical excellence and disability. I don't know that is necessarily on the radar, and I'm imagining, how is it that professional musicians who have a disability manage to find out about you guys, and how you even manage to establish yourselves, and in fact how you're going to do that going forward?
That's a beautifully, I can talk about some of the work we're doing right now, actually. Thank you. There's so to begin with, we started with the 17 that we had in London in 2012.
How did you find them?
I had an email from a friend who knew Charles, and said, "Oh, Charles is setting up an orchestra." It wasn't even called Paraorchestra at that point. I think it was just like an orchestra that will use, he'd like to find disabled musicians to be involved. And I knew Charles as a broadcaster and as a conductor. I didn't know him personally, but I knew of his work and really admired his work. So it's sort of, his name sort of really, made me sit up and note it, because I was like, oh, well, he's a serious musician. He's someone who, like, actually I would really like to be involved with. So, and the 17 who were brought together was a mixture of Charles going out and finding them, and also there was a television company involved in that process as well, because the sort of formation of Paraorchestra was documented for I think it was an hour-long documentary that actually was broadcast just before the closing ceremony on Channel 4, because Channel 4 obviously covered the Paralympic Games in London. So that it was relatively easy for Charles to find those first 17 musicians. And then over the sort of the years that followed, more and more musicians joined on a kind of ad hoc basis, really. So there wasn't a formal process for joining. People either got in touch with Charles on social media, or they got in touch with the people who were organising, Paraorchestra project, or indeed musicians like myself and my colleagues would be recommending other musicians that we knew of that hadn't yet joined, and then they would be brought into the mix. And then 2 years ago, once we'd relocated to Bristol, one of my first jobs as associate music director was to set up a formal musician call out process. So we did our first formal call out 2 years ago, and that was fascinating because it was the first time that we had kind of invited musicians to an audition process in a kind of Parrot Orchestra way.
Oh, sorry, Lloyd. That's my family arriving who don't realise we're doing a filmed interview. Hello, lovely family. I'm just having an interview with the Associate Director of the British Paraorchestra. But I'm recording it, so I have to edit it. So thank you. Love it. Just working from home is all the fun.
Isn't it, Joe? Yeah.
Sorry, Lloyd, do you mind if we go back and you're going to have to re-say that a little bit so it'll make it easy for me to edit? Is that all right?
Where would you like me to go from? From the...
if you could go back to 2018 and setting up the formal call-out process. Thank you.
And then 2 years ago, when I joined the Paraorchestra as Associate Music Director, one of my first jobs was to set up a formal musician call-out process. So it was the first time we had actually opened the doors more widely than just, finding out about musicians on a kind of ad hoc or, through a friend of a friend. And we invited 4 musicians to join our talent pool off the back of that. And we were very clear that we were looking for excellence, and we were looking for musicians who kind of lived and breathed music and also would fit into the program of work that we do. So not musicians who only wanted to work in one style or in one kind of way, but actually musicians who are curious, courageous, interested in kind of pushing their own practice forward really in new and unexpected ways. And I'm pleased to say that the 4 musicians that we chose, we chose 3 playing musicians and 1 composer, and they're all now, an important part of our kind of Paraorchestra family and play on many of our projects, work on many of our projects. So we're doing a new musician call out. We launched it just this week, actually. So 2 years on from the last one, if people are watching this and they are over 18, they're based in the UK, they play music in any style, any genre. So it could be jazz, R&B, classical. There could be a singer, a composer, a music creator, a singer-songwriter. They could be formally trained or not formally trained. They could be part of a rock or pop band. It really could be anything. As long as they are working at a professional level and they're interested in making music with other musicians as part of an orchestral setting or a para-orchestral setting, then we want to hear from them. So that people have 6 weeks to get their applications into us. They just need to go to paraorchestra.com/musician call out. So we put all of the information on the website, and we also have a film on our website as well, which I think gives a sense of the sort of the range of work we do. Charles gives a brief introduction to how the orchestra was set up, why it was set up, to level the playing field. And then we have 6 musicians in our film who are explaining sort of what they like about working with Paraorchestra, how they got involved, and why encouraging other people to get involved if they are interested in doing this kind of work. And then what we'll do is we will look through the applications. It's a very simple application process with 5 or 6 main questions that we'd like people to answer about themselves. They can attach any videos or sound recordings of their work, and indeed if they prefer they can do their application in video form if they're more comfortable applying via video than on we appreciate that some people prefer to sort of represent themselves through just talking about their work rather than writing about it. And then Charles and I will look through the applications after Christmas, and we will invite a short list of musicians to a workshop in January next year, which we'll hold here in Bristol for the first time. Last time we did the workshop in London, but this time we felt it was important to invite people to our home city of Bristol. This is all COVID allowing, of course. We'll have to wait and see what happens with lockdowns and one thing and another. And of course, if people are in a position where they feel uncomfortable or unable to make that journey, we will find alternatives. We'll either audition them online, or we'll meet them at another time and a place that is comfortable for them. But really, we want people to come to the room, and they'll get to meet existing Parrot Orchestra musicians. They'll be able to play their instrument, or if they're a composer or music creator, they'll be able to talk about their practice and their craft. And then Charles and I will make a decision off the back of that, and invite, hopefully, our next tranche of talent to Paraorchestra. And then going into 2021, they'll be able to be part of the projects that we're developing into 2021 and beyond. So the musician call out is really important to us. I think because we do often get emails from people, from time to time saying, oh, I play X instrument, or I know someone who might be interested in joining. How do I join? Well, we feel now that the main route into Paraorchestra is via these musician call-outs, which we will continue to do on a biennial basis. I think every 2 years we will open up in this way and allow people to get their applications into us. And it's a highly unusual process, isn't it? Because often, again, in the orchestral classical music world, or in any kind of music really, people are often looking for one quite sort of specified, bespoke thing. And of course, for Paraorchestra, because of all the things we've been talking about today, where we have this huge range of disabilities, instruments and projects, actually we're able to say, you just need to be a musician, whatever form that might take. That is all we're interested in. We're looking for a second clarinetist and a fourth horn player and a viola player. It's not that at all. It could be those things, but actually it could also be someone who is using Ableton, or using the clarion, or using Headspace, or creating music at home via Logic or Pro Tools. It really doesn't matter to us the means by which you create music. Matters much more to us the quality of what you make and what you have to say through it as well. Do you have like a burning desire to communicate through that music with an audience? Because we are an orchestra, we do live projects, and so we need you to be able to perform at a high level and under pressure. That we are doing projects that are often televised or on radio or to very large audiences, and so we want those musicians who can thrive under that pressure. And we know they're out there. I know a few musicians who I have in mind that I'd love to get in touch, and I've spoken to them about that already. And I know that there are many, many more musicians that I don't know that I haven't met yet. So yeah, the next 5-6 weeks for us leading up to Christmas are really important, and we'll be pushing it on our social media channels. So yeah, get in touch if you know anyone, or if you are a musician who is interested in joining the fun.
Fantastic. What a brilliant opportunity. Are you able to give us a little foretaste about what you guys have got on the books for 2021? Obviously, we know that COVID is likely to disrupt whatever types of plans we might be making, but maybe you can give us a bit of a sneaky look into what's on the calendar.
Definitely. So the next thing we have coming up that we're sharing with the public is just before Christmas, mid-December. There's a broadcast of a documentary that Charles has made called Beethoven and Me. And it's a personal documentary to Charles. He talks about his relationship with Beethoven, the music of Beethoven. This year of 2020 has been, 250 years since Beethoven was born, and it was supposed to be full of celebrations of his music around the globe. And of course, much of that has been cancelled or postponed, sadly. But Charles has made this film for Sky Arts, which is now free to air. So it's a free to air channel that you can find on your Freeview, or you can watch online. And as part of that, Paraorchestra has recorded excerpts from Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. So Charles is going to be unpacking the Fifth Symphony in a very sort of Charlesian way. Like he's going to climb inside the symphony and share with viewers what the symphony might have sounded like if Beethoven had stopped earlier than he did. So Beethoven was someone who worked kind of relentlessly and kind of fastidiously and was a perfectionist basically, but composing didn't really come to Beethoven that naturally, in the same way that it did to Mozart or Haydn or Mendelssohn. They seemed to just compose in a way that was very free and easy, and the music just came out of them and onto the page. And there were stories of people like Rossini just being able to sort of knock out an overture on the morning of the premiere of an opera. That would have never happened with Beethoven. He was someone who constantly revised his music. And so what we've managed to do is, with the help of Paraorchestra, we're going to illustrate what earlier versions of the symphony might have sounded like. And so you can always begin to get a sense of what his thought process was like. So that's the next sort of broadcasting we have coming up. And then in 2021, we have a repeat of our Barry White project, Love Unlimited. We're going to take that to Meltdown Festival at South Bank Centre, which next year is being curated by Grace Jones. So big starry names, which I'm very excited about. And it will be the first time that we've done the project since we played it at Glastonbury, so we're really excited about that. And so we were supposed to be doing that project in 2020, but the Meltdown Festival has been postponed by a year.
So aptly named.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, Meltdown. In May, we're going to go to the Bath Festival, and we're going into the Roman Baths in just down the road from Bristol, and we're going to play a version of Goreski's Symphony of Sorrowful Songs.
Oh, I love that.
Gorgeous piece, isn't it? I mean, it's so, it takes my breath away every time I hear it. And if you can imagine the Roman Baths in Bristol, sort of a group of string players around the edge of the bath, and one of our key members, Victoria Oruwari, who's one of our beautiful sopranos, she's going to sing the solo part of the Goreski. And again, it's going to be one of our kind of promenade, maybe not promenade theatre, but it's going to be a moment where people can climb inside the music and take a moment to contemplate and reflect and just experience this incredibly moving music with its themes of death and sorrow and the afterlife. And I think it's going to be a really moving occasion, I think, in Bath. So that's in May. And then further on into the year, we have a few other secret projects that we're working on at the moment that I can't tell you any more about just yet. But needless to say, it will be much more of the same kind of. It will be, as wide and as varied and as eclectic as we always have tried to be, and it will encompass everything from Beethoven to Barry White to some special guest artists who we're in collaboration with at the moment. We're hoping next year will be the first year we can release our first album. So we're working on, I'm not allowed to say just yet who it will be with, but it will be, Paraorchestra will play a key role in a new album that will be released next year. So these are all kind of exciting things in the pipeline that we want, new musicians for as well. We're not getting rid of any of our existing musicians, we love them, but we just want as many people as possible to be part of this journey. And yeah, inevitably, we will probably be doing more in the UK next year and not touring so much. I think, it would be hard to predict when we might be touring internationally again, but we certainly hope that through a combination of, broadcast and projects that are live streamed, and then hopefully further on into the spring and the summer with the promise of maybe a vaccine, or with once we have the virus under control, we hope very much that we'll be able to get back to performing to live audiences.
Brilliant! Wow, it's gonna be really exciting.
Really exciting. Yeah, I hope so. I just it's like I'm sort of trying not to hedge my bets on it, because you never know when well, we've all learned this year, haven't we, just how unpredictable things can be. And I think what we're focusing on is we're so grateful to the support we've had from Arts Council. The money we've had from the Cultural Recovery Fund from Arts Council has enabled us to plan this future with some degree of certainty, not a complete degree of certainty, but just at least we can plan, and we are learning all the time about the protocols we'll have to put in place, and what we might have to do around testing musicians or social distancing and all the rest of it. It will be an exciting year.
Brilliant, amazing. Well, Lloyd, just very lastly, some of our conversation will be shared as part of Disability History Awareness Month in the next few weeks, at which the University of UWE Bristol will be participating in. And I know that there's sometimes a difficulty with staff who may identify as disabled and those who identify as non-disabled, with how to communicate, how people feel, trying to get dialogue going. I just wonder if you'd be happy, because of the amazingly successful integration you've managed to do in Paraorchestra between disabled and non-disabled professionals, if you would be able to offer any advice to all parts of our community, disabled and non-disabled, about how to make sure that we're getting our professional environment as integrated and inclusive as possible.
Sure. I think it's I think listening and communication is key from all sides. So I think for those who are non-disabled, if people are wondering how they can be supportive and effective allies of the cause, I think it's completely understandable that people may sometimes feel awkward around talking about disability or asking someone about something that you may feel embarrassed to ask about, or you may feel uncomfortable talking about. But I think talking is really important. Again, if 2020 has taught us anything, with things in parallel causes like Black Lives Matter, people are talking now, and I think we need to hear each other more, which might sound a bit wishy-washy, but I think to genuinely listen to each other, and if you're a non-disabled person and you may know someone who is disabled, it may be a friend of yours even, and you haven't addressed the topic of their experiences, of what you could do to help. And when I say what you could do to help, I don't mean anything grand. I sometimes mean, from my perspective as a hearing impaired and visually impaired person, there are very, very practical things that can help me with accessing the world around me. There are still friends of mine who I joke with them that they forget to position themselves in a place where I can see them clearly, so I can lip read them, especially if we're in a nightclub or a pub or somewhere noisy. I need to be able to see their face, and see their face clearly, so I can hear them across the noise. And also when I'm walking down a street with a group of colleagues or friends, I tend to walk alongside them, or even just one or two steps behind them rather than in front of them. Because if I'm walking in front of someone, it's very unlikely I will hear anything they're saying behind me. So I'm often having to sort of crane my neck or sort of just walk slow. I'm quite a fast walker, unfortunately. That's what I mean about, it doesn't have to be any grand gestures. It's just about understanding for the person you might know in your community, what you could do to help that person, and what you could do to understand and hear that person in a more profound way. Could even be, a Zoom conversation like this. If, you know, I'm thinking especially at university, people tend to be, you know, we're all, especially for undergraduates, I remember from my college days, you know, we're all still finding ourselves and understanding how we fit into this community of people, and understanding more about ourselves. We all think we're kind of, you know, fully finished projects or products by the time we get to university at the age of 18, but often, well, our journey is only just sort of starting, and by the time you leave, you're a very different person to the person you are when you get there. And I think if there's someone maybe with a hidden or a visible disability that you haven't spoken much to because you're nervous about offending them or not understanding how to communicate with them, then I just urge you to do what you can to reach out to them in the same way that you might reach out to another colleague or friend that might have mutual interest, and to go beyond the disability and to understand that person for who they are, because they're most likely they'll have the same interest and the same they may even have the same sense of humor as you, or, you know, they may be interested in the same TV programs or the same cultures, or maybe learning the same language as you, or on the same course as you, or fancy the same people as you. You know, it's like they are the same rounded human beings as the rest of us are. And so I would just, I think my main message would be to those who are just nervous around talking about disability, to not be, and to be curious and to listen with open hearts and open minds. And for those who have disabilities, I would say to not worry, especially if you are at a younger age. So if you're just at university and you're wondering whether, especially if you have maybe a hidden impairment that you're worried about disclosing, I think everyone comes to their own, they move at their own pace. You know, I was just very lucky because I had parents and teachers that we talked about today, and mentors like Charles, that in a way, disability for me, it's never been a negative thing for me, actually. And I know I'm massively fortunate because of that. For others, they may have, you know, experienced things in their childhood or in their school days that means that they are nervous about making a sort of point of their disability. But actually, at university and beyond, it's your chance to own it as part of your identity, and to be proud of it, and to through talking about it, you then put other people at their ease as well. So flipping it around from the other side, you know, I mentioned that non-disabled people are often nervous about asking questions. Disabled people can help that by being open, by not shooting people down if they use the wrong language, but just by being kind and listening with care and explaining with care and generosity to our non-disabled people who may not fully understand how they can help, but we can be part of that education process. And unfortunately as well, just like in any walk of life or any form of discrimination, there will always be people who just don't get it. There will always be people who are unkind, and those people, you know, if you do encounter those people as well, then I think it's not on us to change their point of view. We can only change their point of view through being who we are, and unless they are being outright discriminatory in terms of their behavior, you know, if they're behaving like illegally, then I think my view is to use your energy wisely and to not exhaust yourself trying to change the minds of people whose minds will not be changed because of their own ignorance. Try and find those people who are inclined to help and inclined to listen. So it's nothing particularly sort of revelatory in what I'm saying, but it's just like it's actually just taking a moment, and I think a moment like UK Disability History Month can be a useful moment to do that, with more conversations happening in the media and on campuses and amongst people and family and friends. Let's use the moment wisely